Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, I have mentioned that we have this protocol in terms of CBT framework for protocol. We start with intention and we are discussing with intention, and we have not completed the whole cycle of the whole idea of intention in depth. All right, we have discussed, for example, in the previous talk about the Azghari concept and how we're going to include this into CBT. We start with motive, then intention, will and action, and consequences, which we will go into detail. And our motive must be sincere for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then the foundation would be whether it is a primary, our vision, our secondary, our mission, and the programs of action, amaliyat, within this intention of CBT. And then what are the actions that we are going to take and the consequences of the action that are going to be. So this is going to be our concept of intention within CBT. But today I'm going to give you some idea of the idea, because when we talk of intention, the next level is intervention. And after intervention, we have this attitudinal values and transformational development for the person, and then finally self-actualization. All right, self-actualization here. So I've given you in detail, but let's discuss something about, say, intervention, because SEMP integration within CBT, this is our CBT approach. This is CBT. Okay, so I'm going to give you some idea of what is the CBT approach, the biomedical pharmacological approach in terms of drugs, therapeutic drugs and so on. This is we're going to discuss later, just a short review, because this is not within our preview. These are the psychiatrists as well as hospital as well as medical doctors intervention. But cognitive and behavioral at CBT level, there are many approaches. So I'm just giving you one little example from the video that I'm going to show you how CBT behavioral approach in terms of our cognitive intervention, just a short one, and then we can discuss, and then we can maybe discuss how this is different from this. What is CBT different from SEMP integration CBT, and how we're going to approach the intervention. All right, what are the guiding principles in terms of our CBT SEMP integration, because this is going to be a topic that we're going to play over and over again until we know that we have a very strong and very systematic framework, inshallah, which we can present to the world. These are just ideas, as I mentioned to you. We are developing this as we go along, and inshallah, if you yourself can develop this idea, starting with your own framework and protocol for an Islamic framework, that means, as we say, we start with intention, intervention, attitudinal values, additional and values transformation and development, and finally self-actualization, which I'm going to explain. So this intervention, I'm going to play you a short video, and then I can give you some idea of how we're going to approach this and how we can harness the empirical good ideas within CBT to be absorbed and modified according to our SEMP approach, inshallah.
Cognitive behavioral interventions that spans not just ADHD, but all of the different disorders that we target in youth. And obviously, CBT posits that psychiatric disorders are comprised of a number of factors that can be targeted with treatment, namely emotional or affective reactions, physiological symptoms, thoughts or cognitions, and behaviors. But in addition, it's important to recognize that CBT not only looks at the child or the young person, him or herself, but also the context in which the child functions. And those contexts can include families and parents, but also extrafamilial factors, peers, school system. And in developing a CBT plan or a CBT approach, we really want to take into consideration the myriad of factors that can influence the presentation of a disorder. When we're talking about CBT treatments, we're really talking about a whole range of interventions, but these interventions tend to have certain things in common. Namely, they are typically time-limited and focused. They have a focus on manualization, or if manuals or empirically supported interventions aren't available, at the very least, they're founded on empirically supported principles. The sessions are very structured. They have a very predictable beginning, middle, and end, which for individuals, for example, with ADHD, the structure of this can be very containing and very helpful. The therapist is active, so the role of the therapist is one of coach, teacher, encourager in some cases, and the idea is that the process is a collaborative one where the therapist comes to the table with knowledge about skills that can be helpful for intervention, and the child or the family come to the table with expertise in their own symptoms and their own functioning, and together we work to develop a treatment plan that's going to help the person achieve their full potential. And the idea is that for skills to really become consolidated and for treatment to be effective, whatever we work on needs to be practiced not only in session, but also between sessions. And as such, there's real focus on active rehearsal of skills between sessions and assignment of what we can generally call homework. I'm going to talk today about, again, a number of different interventions, and I'm going to present my talk in a developmental framework. So across the full age range of childhood and adulthood, there have been a number of CBT interventions that have been tested and found to be effective. So if we're looking at preschoolers, the kinds of treatments that I'm going to talk about are things like parent training and these kinds of multimodal interventions that integrate a lot of different treatment components. In school-age children, I'm going to focus again on parent training, and parent training is something that you're going to hear quite a bit about throughout my talk. But in addition, since these children are now entering school age, there's been a tremendous focus on developing and testing classroom-based interventions, as well as multimodal interventions. And again, I'll emphasize now, although I won't focus on this so much during my talk because this is a talk on ADHD, CBT for comorbid conditions is also something to really keep in mind. CBT has been very effective for treating a whole host of disorders like anxiety and depression. And so obviously these are the children at these ages that are starting to develop these symptoms and can benefit. Adolescence has been a period that's been remarkably ignored. And although there have been a few treatments developed, you'll really see, and some that have been found to be effective, again, much of the work has been done much earlier in development. And that's an area that we're intervening with now and really looking at a little bit more actively. And then I'll also talk about adult ADHD because although that was another age group that until recently was ignored, there have been some really exciting studies that have come out recently really demonstrating the efficacy of cognitive behavioral interventions, particularly ones focused on organizational skills training for adults with ADHD. So I'm going to start with parent management training. This is probably one of the best known and best researched treatments for youth with ADHD and behavioral problems. And some of you may be familiar, but I'll kind of give you a primer on some of the principles underlying this treatment. Based on traditional behavioral management principles. So the idea is that behaviors are preceded by antecedents and are followed by consequences. And so if you want to change the frequency of a behavior, you can do that by manipulating either what precedes it or what follows it. So if you want to increase a desired behavior, you want to reward that behavior. And this is something that any of you who are parents probably are well versed in. If you want your child to do something, it helps to reward them to do it. If you want to decrease the frequency of a behavior, you punish the behavior. And this is one that people like to focus on a lot, but I'll talk a lot about why that's not sort of where we typically start. But punishment, whether it's timeout, consequences, yelling, well-rehearsed skills. There's this idea of contingent reinforcement, which is that you don't reinforce everything willy-nilly. You selectively reinforce positively or reward behaviors that you want to increase, while at the same time not reinforcing behaviors that you want to extinguish or decrease. It's important to note, however, because I think sometimes there's been a bit of a misnomer thinking that parent training is all about just rewarding and punishing. There's a tremendous focus on identifying and understanding the context in which behaviors are expressed and manipulating antecedents to behaviors. And there's a lot of observation and thought that goes into really noticing what precedes any behavior, whether it's desired or undesired, and figuring out what to do to maximize that system to facilitate the child's ability to be successful. So it's not just, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is consequence-based, but we really want to pay attention to the antecedents as well. Sometimes it's easier to manipulate those than to focus only on consequences. And then it's also important not to underestimate the role of modeling. So children and young people imitate models, whether that's parents, peers, therapists sometimes. And so we really want to maximize the opportunities for children to model appropriate behaviors, particularly in the context in which they're expressed. So why focus on parent management training? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that children with ADHD have deficits in what we will call rule-governed behaviors. So it's really hard for them to comply with adult directives, to do what's expected of them, and in some instances to do what they're told. And so it suggests that parents may need to use more explicit or systematic ways of presenting rules and enforcing them than you might have to do with a child who perhaps doesn't have ADHD. In addition, we also know that ADHD can contribute to problems in the parent-child relationship. So over time, parents can become frustrated, disheartened. They may develop maladaptive ways of dealing with their children. There are these mutual cycles of coercion where you see this escalating pattern of do this or else, and the child will defy, and then the parent will escalate the demand or the behavior, and the child will still defy, and then the parent will escalate again, and then maybe the child will comply. But over time, what you see is this kind of progressive escalation of non-compliance and parental frustration, leading to, in some cases, really unhelpful behaviors on both sides. And there's evidence that suggests that if you modify poor parenting practices, you can really enhance outcomes in children. This is not meant to blame parents. I think there's a lot of empathy and a lot of recognition about how difficult it can be to parent a child with ADHD, but rather it's just an observation that there may be some parenting practices that are more helpful than others. I wanted to give you a sense of the various parent management approaches that have been developed and tested. And although they are all a little bit different, they really share quite a few of those strategies I'm about to talk about in common. And they're all readily available for use. So across these various treatments, all these interventions start with a lot of psychoeducation. And in part, you're trying to get a sense of how parents and children understand ADHD, any misperceptions they might have about ADHD or aggressive behaviors, and really trying to inform parents about why it is so hard for their children to comply with what seems to even sometimes be a simple direction. And this is critical, obviously, to start to recreate an alliance between the parent and child against, if you will, the common enemy of ADHD or non-compliance. You also want to get a sense of whether there may be any behaviors that may be reinforcing or perceptions of aggression or certain behaviors as good in some instances. So sometimes parents may like that their kid is tough or stands up for himself, but in fact they may be inadvertently reinforcing some inappropriate behaviors. And then the beginning of all of these treatments is really on rewarding pro-social behaviors. So nowhere will you ever see that we start with figuring out how to punish kids better, which is often what parents will want to know how to do. Really, there is lots of it as that punishment is the least effective form of behavior management that we know. So if you want to have a child get better at doing what you want them to do, punishment is not the way to do it. It's sort of your last resort, but there's no evidence that says that this is the route to go. Instead, what really works is reinforcing positive behaviors. And parents will come and say, well, there is no positive behavior to reinforce. What we really start by doing is having parents attend to anything that might be positive, which in some cases may be even just the absence of a negative, which is fine. But we really want to start having them not just kind of cross their fingers and say, oh, thank goodness I have 5 minutes where I don't have to scream, but really start to notice times where their child is acting appropriately or doing something, and there's shaping, so even if it's gradual, it doesn't have to be perfect, but just...
Okay, Alhamdulillah, this is a short video on the cognitive behavioral approach for ADHD. There are many other material on anxiety, depression, bipolar, and so on, which actually you can access, and actually we should really credit the CBT world, all the research, the thousands of papers that has been developed to enhance the capacity of cognitive behavior therapy intervention. But what you can see here is also that it is very Islamic. The only thing that is missing is, for example, the approach in terms of the spiritual aspect. Okay, so here it is value free. There is no value insofar as CBT and CBT, so it is value free. They don't talk about values. They don't talk about spirituality and so on. So from our perspective, the SEMP integration pipe for 5CBT, we have from the very beginning of intervention have a guiding principle in terms of how are we going to approach it. So there must be a principle of 5CBT integration in terms of intervention. How are we going to start that intervention? And that is a very important approach. So we have discussed on intention, which I have not completed the discussion because we're going to go into the other aspects of intervention. But of intention, then we have to go into this intervention. I have given you some idea of this intervention, and inshallah, as we go develop this CBT protocol, we can also develop an idea of why this SEMP integration is better than CBT, where it has values and it has spirituality. And for that, you can go to the book. Okay, we have actually for intervention in terms of ADHD, we have this Khalifa method that was developed by the late Professor Muhammad Mahdi Jenkins, and we have one whole chapter on being the Khalifa of Allah on this earth. So it's a very beautiful approach in terms of how we're going to approach children with ADHD using this Khalifa method of giving them the idea of how they can be good, how they can help others to be good, and making the world good in very simple storytelling kind of approach, very moderate, very gentle, very loving, very caring, full of empathy. And those are the guiding principles. But it's always going back to Allah, the love of Allah, and so on. That will be actually radically different from CBT. So maybe some of you will be shocked. You mean there is a psychology of that nature? Yes, there must be a psychology of that nature, because then how are you going to reach the inner core of ourselves? How are you going to reach the inner core of the child who is having that problem? Unless we can approach them through love and mercy, compassion, gentleness, kindness, and a reward system based on this intrinsic value of the principles and the model of positive Islamic psychology and Islamic psychology, which I have discussed the model over and over again. But how are we going to integrate that into our system so that our intervention, inshallah, would be an upgrade of the CBT and becoming CBT. And inshallah, when we do that, we can present this to the world and help shape and make an ummah of achievers, an ummah that can live in the 21st century, well balanced, well psychologically very, very good, a good family structure that can bring up wonderful children, and we can be an example to other communities of the world so that we can live in peace with all, achieving peace, happiness, and success for the ummah and for our family and for all humanity in a way of being the Caliph of Allah, always striving to make ourselves good, helping others to be good, making the world good, inshallah.